The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, biting mercilessly into the wrists of the most powerful man in Maplewood, and the officer who put them there had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. That is where this story ends up. But it is not where it begins. Because to understand what happened on that rain-soaked October night on Westbrook Avenue, you first have to understand the city itself, the particular geography of a place that had been breaking its own promises for so long that most of its residents had simply stopped expecting anything different. Maplewood was a city of 480,000 people, and like most American cities of its size, it carried two identities inside one set of borders, wearing them simultaneously, never quite reconciling them. Drive north from the center of town, and you would find the North Gate business corridor gleaming glass towers that caught the morning sun and threw it back at you. Manicured median strips lined with Bradford pear trees, sidewalks that were repaired within 72 hours of a complaint being filed. Restaurants where the prix-fixe dinner cost more than a South Ward family spent on groceries in a week. Drive south from the same center point, and the city changed in ways that no amount of civic optimism could paper over. The streets narrowed and buckled. The street lights were spaced wider apart, and half of them didn't work. The library closed at 5 because there wasn't funding for evening staff. The elementary schools ran bake sales to buy copy paper. Between these two worlds ran a single elevated highway overpass, a concrete structure that was 14 years old and had never once been painted, and which had become over time a symbol so obvious that local journalists had stopped writing about it because there was nothing new to say. People on both sides of it knew what it meant. The people who lived north of it pretended it didn't divide anything. The people who lived south of it knew it divided everything. Maplewood had cycled through 3 mayors in 8 years, each of them arriving with a set of promises that sounded sincere and a political debt that turned out to be larger than the promises. The first had pledged to address the infrastructure disparity between the North and South wards, and had instead spent his tenure managing a pension crisis that he had partly inherited and partly made worse. The second had campaigned on police reform and hired a consultant who produced a 200-page report that sat in the City Hall archive unread. The third had served 1 term, with the specific energy of a person who wanted desperately to be liked, and had therefore never done anything that anyone could dislike, which meant she had also never done anything that mattered. The wound that ran deepest in Maplewood was not the crumbling sidewalks, or the underfunded schools, or the inequality of infrastructure that everyone could see, and most people in power had learned to unsee. The deepest wound was the relationship between the Maplewood Police Department and the community it was supposed to serve, a relationship that had not merely deteriorated, but had in certain places been burned entirely to the ground. In 2019, a 22-year-old named Darnell Okafor was shot during a traffic stop on Birchwood Street in the South Ward. He was unarmed. The officer who shot him claimed he reached toward the center console in a manner that suggested a weapon was present. The subsequent investigation found the claim credible enough to avoid a charge. The city paid a settlement of $1.4 million to Darnell's family under the condition that the terms remain confidential. The officer returned to duty 6 months later and was never reassigned, never retrained in any documented way, never required to explain himself in a public forum. Darnell Okafor's mother, a woman named Vivian, who had worked the cafeteria line at Jefferson Elementary for 11 years, still drove past Birchwood Street every morning on her way to work, and still, every single morning, looked away. That was the city as it existed on the night of October 14th. A city balanced on the accumulated weight of its own failures, waiting, without quite knowing it, for something to change. And something was, in fact, about to change. Not because the machine had finally decided to correct itself, but because one man had decided that the most important thing he could do with the power he had just been given was to go find out firsthand exactly how broken things really were. Devlin Carter was 44 years old, and he had been the mayor of Maplewood for exactly 6 weeks and 3 days when the night of October 14th arrived. He had won the election by the largest margin in the city's modern history, carrying not just the South Ward, which everyone expected, but also 3 Northgate precincts that had voted Republican in 4 of the last 5 mayoral cycles, which nobody expected, including Devlin himself. The margin was wide enough that the political consultants had spent the weeks after the election writing op-eds about what it meant, most of them getting it wrong, in the way that people who study politics from a distance tend to get things wrong. They attributed his victory to messaging, to timing, to a favorable political climate, to the failures of his opponent, when the actual explanation was simpler and harder to quantify. People believed him, and they believed him because he was not performing conviction. He actually had it. He was a broad-shouldered man, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair that had gone gray faster than he deserved, and hands that still carried the faint calluses of the construction work he had done through the summers of his undergraduate years, hauling concrete block on residential sites in a part of the city where the houses being built would eventually be owned by people who never thought about who built them. He looked equally at home in a Georgetown lecture hall and on a South Ward stoop, which was not a performance, it was geography, the specific shape that a person takes when they have genuinely lived in both kinds of places. He was born 6 blocks from the Maplewood overpass on the south side of it, in a 2-bedroom house on Callaway Street, where he and his mother shared a home that was too small and too cold in the winters, and exactly sufficient in every way that counted. His mother was Gloria Carter, 68 years old now, and still living on Callaway Street, still setting her keys on the same hook by the front door that she had installed in 1987. Gloria had worked the overnight shift at the hospital laundry for 19 years. 19 years of loading industrial washers with the sheets and gowns of people she would never meet. 19 years of coming home at dawn, smelling of bleach and detergent, with her hands red from the hot water. 19 years of setting those keys on that hook and saying the same thing to her son before she went to sleep. Still here? That's something. Devlin had heard that phrase so many times in his childhood that it had become part of his interior architecture, the load-bearing wall of how he understood perseverance not as triumph, not as progress necessarily, but as the fundamental act of refusing to disappear. Still here. That's something. He had earned a full scholarship to a state university through grades that were not the result of natural brilliance, but of the specific kind of focused intensity that develops in children who understand that education is the only leverage they have. He went on to law school, graduated in the top third of his class, receives 2 offers from corporate firms downtown that would have paid him enough to move into Northgate within 2 years, and turned both of them down. He came back to the South Ward and spent a decade as a civil rights attorney representing residents who had been wrongfully cited, improperly evicted, unlawfully stopped, or brutalized by city systems that had learned over many years to count on the fact that the people it abused were unlikely to have the resources to fight back. He had won cases and lost cases, and the losses had taught him things that the wins couldn't. Specifically that individual victories inside a broken structure were not enough. That you could win one family's case and see the same officer arrest the next family the following week, and that the only way to actually change what happened on the streets was to change who controlled what happened in the buildings behind the streets. He had a character flaw, and the people who loved him most were the clearest about naming it. He was too patient, too willing to believe that institutions could be reformed from within if enough careful pressure was applied over enough time. Too reluctant to burn things down, even when burning was what the situation required. His chief of staff, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, who had managed 3 campaigns and trusted her instincts above almost everything, had told him this in their first week in office. His wife, Renee, had been telling him a version of it for years. Renee Carter was a high school principal in the South Ward, a woman with an extraordinarily precise mind and the particular emotional fluency of someone who spent her days navigating the interior lives of teenagers, which meant she was almost impossible to deceive and almost impossible to rattle. They had been married for 16 years. She knew when Devlin was performing confidence and when he actually had it, and she had never once confused the two. Their daughter, Layla, was 13, played piano with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that music was a language and was determined to become fluent, and asked her father questions at the dinner table that he sometimes needed a day to answer properly. On the night of October 14th, Devlin had been in his City Hall office until 10:30 p.m., working through a budget revision that the City Council needed to review by Thursday, when he pulled up his email and found buried under 47 other messages a constituent complaint about a collapsing storm drain on Westbrook Avenue in Northgate, near the edge of a district where Northgate's wealth began to taper into something more complicated. The email had been sent 4 days ago. It was the third email from this constituent on the subject. The storm drain was located half a block from a public elementary school. He closed the budget file, turned off his desk lamp, and sat for a moment in the dark of his office and made a decision. The elevator from the 7th floor of City Hall took 40 seconds to reach the underground garage, and Devlin spent those 40 seconds having a conversation with himself that he would later describe to Renee as the most important 40 seconds of his entire term in office. He had two options, and he was honest enough with himself to see both of them clearly. He could take the official city SUV, call his security detail, and drive out to Westbrook Avenue in the way that a mayor was supposed to travel. Visible, protected, announced the arrival of a civic official inspecting a constituent complaint, which was a perfectly reasonable and defensible thing to do, and would almost certainly result in the storm drain being repaired within a week, and a positive mention in the community newsletter. Or he could take his personal vehicle, go alone, and see what happened. The second option was not impulsive. He had been thinking about it in one form or another for the entire 6 weeks he had been in office, ever since he had started reading the internal affairs files that Patricia had pulled for him during the transition period. Those files told a story that was specific and documented and deeply familiar because he had spent a decade working with the people on the receiving end of it. The story they told was this: every officer under review had a pattern, and the pattern only operated in certain conditions, and the most important condition was the absence of observation. Every excessive force incident, every fabricated probable cause, every complaint that had been buried under procedural paperwork. These things happened when the officer in question believed that nobody who mattered was watching. Devlin had been thinking about what it would mean to be nobody. Not Mayor Carter arriving in a motorcade with his detail and his press secretary, and the implicit weight of office that changed the temperature of every interaction he walked into. Just a man. A black man in a hoodie, driving a car with South Ward plates through Northgate at 11 o'clock on a rainy October night. He wanted to know what that felt like, in his own city, in the year of his tenure, after 6 weeks of sitting in meetings about reform and accountability and community trust. He wanted to know what the raw material actually was, before he started talking about what to build with it. He named the risk to himself explicitly, standing in the elevator as the floors descended, because he was a civil rights attorney, and he understood exactly what the risk was. He had represented clients who had sat in exactly the position he was about to voluntarily put himself in, and some of them had walked out fine, and some of them had not. And the difference between those outcomes had never been fully within their control. He was 44 years old, he was the mayor of a city, and he was black. And those three facts existed simultaneously, and none of them canceled out the others. He chose to go anyway. Not out of recklessness, and not out of a need to prove something to himself, but out of a conviction that had been building in him since his first day in office. A leader who had never stood in the shoes of the most vulnerable people in his city had no business making decisions about their lives from a 7th-floor office. He needed to know what his city felt like from the ground. He changed clothes in the private bathroom off his office. Gray university hoodie, soft and worn from years of washing. Dark jeans. The old cap from a South Ward Little League team he had coached for 2 summers in his early 30s. He took his personal car keys from his desk drawer. The Malibu was registered under a family trust his attorney had established before the campaign for privacy reasons, which meant that a plate check would return the trust name rather than his own. He left a voicemail for his detail supervisor, not asking permission, just informing, because they needed to know his location for safety reasons, and because he respected the people who protected him enough to be honest with them. And he drove north out of the City Hall garage into the wet October dark, alone. Anonymous. Nobody. The way most of the people he served moved through this city every single night. 3 miles to the north, in the North Gate Patrol Sector, Car 31 of the Maplewood Police Department was rolling slowly down rain-slicked streets, with its headlights cutting pale cones through the mist, and the man behind the wheel was looking for something to punish. Officer Colt Reeves was 39 years old and had been with the department for 14 years, which was long enough to have moved well past the idealism of his early days and arrived at something harder and more settled, a philosophy of the street that he had built piece by piece from his own experience and his own assumptions, and called instinct, because calling it something else would have required a kind of self-examination he had never been willing to do. He was broad through the chest, in the way of a man who had once been athletic and had since found other outlets for the energy, with a jaw set permanently tight and eyes that moved across every street corner in a constant scanning motion. Not the professional vigilance of a trained officer, but the hungry attention of a man who expected to find trouble everywhere, because trouble confirmed what he already believed. He wore his uniform with the particular tightness of someone who needed the authority it represented, who would have been considerably less certain of himself without the badge and the belt and the weight of the service weapon on his hip. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood just east of Northgate, in a house where the dinner table conversation was shaped by his father's resentment, a man who had spent 30 years installing heating and cooling systems in Northgate homes, and had come home every night smelling of other people's money, of the comfort he maintained for people who would never learn his name. His father had passed that resentment down as carefully and consistently as a genetic trait, and Colt had received it and built upon it, had turned it into a worldview that sorted people into categories with the efficiency of a machine that had been calibrated to produce a specific output. His personnel file was, by any objective measure, a document of institutional failure, not his failure alone, but the failure of every supervisor and review board and union representative who had looked at what was accumulating in that file and decided that the path of least resistance was the better path. 11 excessive force complaints over 14 years, spanning incidents that ranged from unnecessary roughness during routine stops to an incident in 2021 in which a South Ward resident named Marcus Tillman had been held for 6 hours on fabricated charges of disorderly conduct, charges that were later dropped when a witness came forward with phone footage that contradicted the arrest report entirely. 2 civil rights lawsuits had been filed against the city, naming Reeves as a defendant, both settled quietly by the city's insurance carrier for amounts that were modest enough to be absorbed without much notice, and large enough to confirm to anyone paying attention that the city had concluded it was cheaper to pay than to correct. A disciplinary hearing in 2021 had recommended a 30-day suspension without pay. The police union had contested the finding, and after 6 weeks of arbitration, the penalty had been reduced to a written warning and a mandatory training module that Reeves completed online in 43 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, had never thought about again. His personal life had collapsed in direct proportion to the professional rot, though Reeves had never connected the two trajectories in any way that produced insight. His wife Sandra had left him 14 months ago, had taken their son Owen to her mother's house in a town 3 hours away, had filed the divorce papers through a lawyer who communicated exclusively by email. Owen was 16 now, and had not returned a call in 6 months. The last time they had spoken, Colt had been trying to explain himself, his record, his reputation, the complaints. And Owen had listened to all of it with a patience that Colt had initially mistaken for sympathy, and then had said, in the flat and certain voice of a teenager who had arrived at a conclusion after considerable thought, "You're not a cop, Dad. You're just a bully with a badge. And I'm ashamed of it." He had hung up without waiting for a response, and Reeves had sat with the phone in his hand for 4 minutes without moving, and had then gotten in his car and driven to a bar, and had never once, in the 14 months since, allowed himself to think about whether Owen might have been right. Tonight he was in a worse mood than usual, if such a gradient was meaningful. He had been passed over for sergeant for the 3rd time last week. The denial memo citing ongoing concerns regarding community relations and professional conduct in language so carefully bureaucratic that it communicated everything while committing to nothing. He had read the memo 3 times, his jaw getting tighter with each pass, and had spent the week since doing his job with the particular aggression of a man who was looking for somewhere to deposit his fury. In the passenger seat, Officer Jake Calloway sat with his notepad on his knee and his eyes moving between the windshield and his training officer with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the room without appearing to read it. Calloway was 24 years old, 7 months out of the academy, still carrying enough of his original idealism to feel uncomfortable in certain situations that Reeves seemed to find entirely comfortable. He had grown up in a working-class family in the western part of the county, the son of a firefighter who had raised him on the idea that public service was a calling rather than a career, that the uniform meant something beyond the authority it conferred, and that the measure of a person in that uniform was how they treated people who had no power over them. 7 months with Colt Reeves had not destroyed that belief, but it had put it under considerable pressure, the kind of pressure that either clarifies or cracks, and Calloway had not yet been forced to find out which kind he was made of. Tonight would answer that question, in a way he was not prepared for. Devlin drove north through the city with the radio off and the window cracked slightly, despite the rain, because he wanted to hear the city rather than cover it with sound. And what he heard as he moved from south to north was the specific sonic texture of inequality. The South Ward, loud with the human noise of people living close together in insufficient space, then the strange acoustic middle ground around the overpass, then the gradual settling into the quieter, better-managed hum of Northgate, where the distance between houses was greater, and the noise ordinances were actually enforced. He noticed things the way a man notices things when he is paying the kind of attention that a decade in civil rights law had trained into him. The broken street light on Morrison Avenue that had been in a constituent email 2 weeks ago. The cracked sidewalk at the corner of 5th and Birchwood that was a liability waiting to happen. The elementary school on the north edge of the South Ward that looked from the outside like it had received its last major maintenance sometime in the late 1990s. He filed each of these things in the mental list he kept, the running inventory of what needed fixing in a city that had let its own infrastructure become a measure of whose life mattered more. He found Westbrook Avenue without difficulty, turned onto it, and immediately saw the storm drain, or rather the absence of one. The subsidence at the curb where the concrete had given way and left a depression large enough to swallow a bicycle wheel, located 8 feet from the entrance to a residential street that the school children would use on their morning walk. He pulled to the curb, cut the engine, and leaned forward to look at it more closely, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the extent of the damage, noting the crack lines radiating outward from the collapsed section. He had been there for perhaps 2 minutes when he saw in the rearview mirror the headlights of a vehicle turning onto Westbrook Avenue from the south end. Not the random headlights of a neighbor coming home late, but the slow, deliberate roll of a car that was moving at less than 10 miles per hour, for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic conditions. A vehicle whose pace communicated something to Devlin's experience-honed perception that made him go very still. 2 blocks behind him, car 31 turned onto Westbrook Avenue, and in the driver's seat, Colt Reeves had already seen the Navy Chevy Malibu parked at the curb, with its engine off and a figure leaning forward inside it, shining a light toward the street. Through the windshield in the particular way that bias warps perception, he processed the scene not as what it was, a man examining a storm drain, but through the filter of everything he already believed about who belonged on this street at this hour and who didn't. He saw the plates and noted they were from a South Ward zip code. He saw the age and condition of the vehicle, which was inconsistent with what Northgate residents drove. He saw a black man in a dark hoodie leaning toward the window with a light, and the narrative assembled itself in his mind in less than 4 seconds, fully formed and internally consistent, because that is how prejudice operates. It doesn't deliberate. It confirms. Calloway, watching from the passenger's seat, offered a reasonable alternative explanation. Someone lost someone visiting family, someone connected to the graduation weekend at the local school. And Reeves silenced him with a single sideways look that communicated everything about the hierarchy in that cruiser. Then, Reeves reached for the light bar switch, and the darkness of Westbrook Avenue exploded in red and blue. Devlin saw the lights in his rearview mirror, and his first reaction was not fear, it was recognition. A deep, bone-level, full-body recognition of a feeling that he had not felt in its full intensity since he was 22 years old, and driving a borrowed car through a neighborhood that was not his. A feeling that he had spent years listening to his clients describe, translating their descriptions into the precise legal language required by courtroom proceedings, but which he had never let himself fully inhabit. Because inhabiting it while simultaneously trying to strategize on their behalf would have been too much to carry at once. Now, sitting in the driver's seat of a Chevy Malibu on Westbrook Avenue in Northgate at 11:15 on a rainy Tuesday night, he let himself feel it completely. Let it move through him, the way he had learned to let things move through him when he needed to understand them, rather than manage them. His mind ran through its civil rights attorney checklist with the efficiency of something long practiced. He was parked, legally, engine off, had committed no moving violation. The car's registration and insurance were current. There was no outstanding warrant, and the worst thing that a reasonable officer could say about his presence here was that a man was sitting in a parked car on a public street, which was not under any reading of any law he had ever studied. A crime. He also knew, with the parallel awareness of a person who has spent a decade doing this work, that the law as written and the law as practiced were two different documents, and that the gap between them was where people got hurt. He made his decision in the space of 3 seconds, and he made it deliberately. With the full weight of what he knew behind it, he would not reveal who he was. Not yet, possibly not at all, tonight, depending on how things developed. Not because he was afraid, though fear was present in him as it would be present in any reasonable person in this situation, but because the information he had come to collect required that he be nobody. He said it to himself, in the interior voice he used for closing arguments, the voice that had to be certain before it could be convincing. A mayor who can only receive fair treatment by declaring himself the mayor has not learned a single thing about his own city. Let this play out. Take note of everything. Let the record build itself. He pulled the window down fully, placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, took a breath that was deeper than a casual breath, and waited. Reeves's approach was the approach of a man who owned the street he walked on, not the professional gait of an officer conducting a safety stop, but the proprietorial swagger of someone establishing dominance before a single word had been spoken. The heavy footfall of authority that has never been required to justify itself. He aimed the tactical flashlight directly into Devlin's eyes before he had even reached the window. A move so casual in its aggression that Devlin understood it had been done many times before. "Good evening, Officer Devlin," said. His voice calibrated the way a voice is calibrated after years of courtroom work. Calm, steady, neither combative nor servile. A voice that asserted its own dignity without claiming any territory that didn't belong to it. The first words out of Reeves's mouth were not a greeting. They were not an explanation. They were an order, license, registration, insurance, delivered in the tone of a man who expected things to arrive before he finished asking for them. And in the rear quarter panel of the Malibu, Calloway stood with his hand near but not on his belt, watching his training officer initiate a stop that he already knew from his first week in the academy did not have the probable cause that the law required. Reeves took Devlin's license and brought it up to the flashlight, and the name he read, Devlin Carter, did not register as anything beyond a name, because Colt Reeves was not the kind of officer who paid attention to the political life of his city. who read the news beyond the crime reports, who had any particular awareness of the man who had just been elected mayor by the largest margin in modern Maplewood history. To Reeves, mayors were names on the memos that came down from above, telling him to do his job differently, and he resented them all with equal generic contempt. He noted the South Ward address on the license and used it immediately, the way a man uses a tool he's been waiting to pick up, holding it out as both evidence and accusation. Because to Reeves's logic, a South Ward address in Northgate at 11 p.m. explained everything that needed explaining. The contempt in his voice when he referenced the South Ward was not disguised, not even slightly, and Devlin heard it with the clarity of someone who had grown up on the receiving end of exactly that tone, and had spent his adult life representing people who absorbed it in silence because they had no other option. Reeves's questions did not follow the pattern of a legitimate investigation. They followed the pattern of someone building a case backward from a conclusion already reached, assembling a narrative rather than examining reality. What are you doing here? Where are you going? Who do you know in this neighborhood? The questions came in a rhythm that Devlin recognized from years of reviewing police reports. The rhythm of a man generating documentation of suspicion, rather than actually investigating anything. Devlin answered each question with precision and minimum information, giving Reeves nothing to work with, and nothing to be challenged on the discipline of a person who understood that in this kind of interaction, every additional word was a potential weapon in hands that were already looking for one. He did not volunteer. He did not grovel. He did not perform the particular kind of anxious deference that Reeves had come to expect from people he stopped in this neighborhood. And the absence of that deference was itself something Reeves read as evidence of guilt. Because his framework had no category for a black man in a Northgate street at this hour who was calm and legally informed, and not afraid of him. When Devlin asked in the measured voice of a man who had spoken those words professionally many times before, whether he was being detained or free to go, the question landed on Colt Reeves the way a precise legal question lands on a man who has never had to answer one, not as information, but as an insult. His jaw tightened in a way that was visible from 6 feet away. Calloway shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, a small, involuntary adjustment that Devlin noticed from the corner of his eye. And what Calloway's body was doing was processing the same legal question and arriving at the same answer that any honest officer would arrive at. There was no lawful basis for this detention, and the correct response to the question was to acknowledge that and let the man go. Calloway did not say this. He let the moment pass, and a letting pass was itself a choice, though Calloway was not yet quite ready to name it as one. Reeves's manufactured anger, the particular fury of a man who has confused compliance with respect and is now being given the former without the latter, spilled over in the way that it always eventually did. He ordered Devlin out of the vehicle, citing Pennsylvania versus Mims with the confidence of someone who knows the name of the case without particularly understanding the conditions under which it applies. Devlin knew the case. He knew it better than Reeves did. He also knew that the stop itself was unlawful, which made the order to exit technically unenforceable. But he weighed that knowledge against the other things he knew. That he was alone on a dark street with an armed officer who was already operating outside his authority and whose anger was visibly escalating. That he had a wife and a daughter. That he had seen too many situations where a man's legal correctness was posthumously established at a proceeding he was not alive to attend. And he made the pragmatic choice of a man who understood that there were battles to have tonight, and battles to have tomorrow, and that surviving to have tomorrow's battles was the precondition for everything else. "I am stepping out," he said, and pulled the door handle. The moment Devlin's feet touched the wet pavement of Westbrook Avenue, Reeves was on him. The grab came from behind and to the left, Reeves's thick hand closing around the shoulder of the hoodie and spinning Devlin with a force that was more than the situation required by any professional standard, but which was entirely consistent with the conduct that had generated 11 complaints over 14 years. the casual, practiced violence of a man who had applied this specific amount of force to this specific kind of situation many times before, and had never once been required to stop. Devlin was spun and pressed against the roof of the Malibu, his cheek against the cold, wet metal, the impact sharp enough to push the air out of his lungs in a compressed rush. He did not resist. Every instinct in his body, the instincts of a man who was physically capable of resisting, who had played defensive end for 2 years of college football and still ran 5 miles every other morning, every one of those instincts was overridden by the trained discipline of a man who had counseled dozens of clients on what this moment required. No sudden movements, no raised voice, no physical resistance, because physical resistance was the thing that turned a bad situation into a catastrophic one, and because documentation required a witness who had not given the other side anything to use. He announced his compliance out loud and clearly, making sure his voice carried to the periphery of the street, to Calloway at the rear of the car, to any resident behind any window on Westbrook Avenue who might be hearing what was happening. Reeves pressed his forearm into the back of Devlin's neck and began a pat-down that had the rough, invasive quality of a search conducted by a man who was more interested in dominance than an officer's safety. His hands moving with the carelessness of someone performing a ritual rather than executing a procedure. Calloway jogged up from the rear of the car, and Devlin could hear in the sound of his footsteps, quick, uneven, slightly too fast, the signature of a young officer who was approaching a situation he didn't want to be in and had not yet figured out how to exit. Calloway said something small and inadequate, some version of, "Maybe we should," or, "He doesn't seem to be." The beginning of an objection that was extinguished by a single word from Reeves, before it could become a sentence. And then Calloway went quiet, which was the loudest thing he did on Westbrook Avenue that night. The handcuffs went on behind Devlin's back, not because the situation required restraint. A man who had announced his compliance and offered no physical resistance requires no restraint under any use of force standard that any department in the country officially endorsed, but because the handcuffs communicated something that Reeves needed communicated, a statement about who was in control of this piece of sidewalk. And then, because 14 years of unchecked conduct had taught Reeves that he could, he ratcheted the cuffs 1 notch tighter than the standard setting, tight enough that the steel edge bit into the skin of Devlin's wrists immediately, tight enough that anyone who examined those wrists in the next hour would see the mark. In the cruiser heading north toward the 4th Precinct, Reeves was talking the monologue of a man who needs the sound of his own certainty, explaining to Calloway and to himself the logic that had produced what had just happened. The logic that always conveniently confirmed what he already believed about who belonged where, and what their presence in the wrong place meant. Devlin, in the back seat, said nothing. He was not listening to the monologue. He was working, logging the badge number visible in the rear-view light's angle, the cruiser number stenciled on the partition, the precise sequence of events since the light bar came on, the exact words Reeves had used, the specific language of the lies Reeves had told about his driving, the feel of the cuffs as evidence of the force applied. He was building the case the way he had always built cases, from the inside out, from the specific to the general, from one man's conduct on one street to the pattern it represented, and the structure that had allowed the pattern to operate unchallenged for 14 years. The difference between tonight and all the other times he had built cases like this was that tonight he was the client. Calloway glanced in the rearview mirror. Their eyes met for 3 seconds, long enough for Devlin to see everything he needed to see. This was not a corrupt young officer. This was a frightened one, which was a different problem, and importantly, a different kind of opportunity. The 4th Precinct was a brutalist concrete building that seemed to have been designed with the specific intention of communicating to everyone who entered it, voluntarily or otherwise, that the building was permanent, and they were not. That the institution outlasted the individual in every direction and at every scale. and that the proper posture upon crossing the threshold was something adjacent to submission. Inside, the booking area smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee, and the specific kind of human exhaustion that accumulates in spaces where difficult things happen repeatedly and without resolution. The fluorescent lights were the kind that ran slightly too warm and made everyone look slightly too pale, and the walls were a shade of seafoam green that had been chosen by someone at some point in the 1980s and had never been reconsidered. Desk Sergeant Ray Kowalski was 58 years old and 3 years from the retirement he had been planning in his head since he turned 50, and the planning of it had become a kind of private consolation, a mental space he retreated to during shifts that required more from him than he wanted to give. He had been a good officer at one point in his career. There was evidence of this in his early file, and had gradually become a man who processed what arrived at his desk without examining it too closely. Not out of corruption, exactly, but out of the specific fatigue of someone who has witnessed institutional failure for long enough that the gap between what should happen and what does happen has stopped feeling like a gap and started feeling like the landscape. Reeves delivered Devlin to the desk with the performance of a man who had been waiting to perform, loud enough for the detectives at the nearby desks to hear his description of the arrest. A small and practiced work of fiction that bore the structural hallmarks of an arrest report composed backward from the desired charges. Devlin listens to the fiction with the particular attention of a man cataloging perjury as it was being committed. And then when Reeves was finished, corrected the record in the calm, specific language of a civil rights attorney who knew exactly which elements of the account were false and could name the violations they represented. Kowalski looked up from his keyboard. Suspects who were brought in on prowling and resisting charges did not typically do this. They cursed, they cried, they slurred, they demanded their phone call in voices that suggested they had been through this before and knew the ritual. They did not use the vocabulary of civil procedure or cite the specific constitutional provisions that had been violated during their arrest. The cognitive dissonance was visible in Kowalski's face, not enough to produce action, not enough to make him say anything, but enough to make him look at Devlin Carter with a different quality of attention than he had looked at the previous 40 people who had stood at this counter tonight. When Reeves turned to Calloway and asked him to confirm the arrest narrative, Calloway stepped forward and chose his words with the care of a man walking on ice he suspects is thin, neither lying outright nor telling the full truth. His hedged language, a careful structure that preserved his professional relationship with Reeves while technically not committing him to a false statement. And that careful structure was itself, Devlin noted, a form of cowardice, because it was designed to avoid consequence rather than to honor principle. Devlin's property was removed and placed in a plastic bin. His wallet, his keys, his cap. The city-issued encrypted phone, small and flat, remained in the inner chest pocket of the hoodie, undetected, because the pat-down in the precinct was more cursory than the one on the street, because the one on the street had been about dominance, and this one was just procedure. He was taken to the holding cells. Cell 7 was 10 by 10 feet of steel bars and reinforced concrete, lit by a single fluorescent panel that had been buzzing at a slightly irregular frequency for long enough that no one had bothered to report it anymore. Because in the hierarchy of things that needed fixing in the Maplewood municipal budget, a buzzing light in a holding cell occupied a position so far from the top of the list that it might as well not exist. There were 2 other men inside. An older man in a canvas work jacket was asleep on the concrete bench with his head on his arm, snoring, with the rhythmic commitment of someone who had made peace with his surroundings and was extracting what rest he could. A younger man, mid-20s, Devlin estimated, wearing a hoodie not dissimilar to Devlin's own, sat against the far wall with his knees pulled up and his eyes open, looking at the middle distance with an expression that was not despair and was not resignation, but was something that existed between them, the particular expression of someone who has been in this situation before and has arrived at a precise understanding of exactly how much it costs to be here. Devlin sat on the bench, placed his hands on his knees, and looked at the camera mounted in the upper corner of the cell. Looked at it directly, calmly, without defiance and without performance. The look of a man who wanted the record to reflect that he was not agitated, not disruptive, not what he had been described as. The young man against the wall looked at him. The silence between them stretched for a moment, and then the young man said, without particular inflection, "Didn't do it either?" It was not a question. Devlin answered, no. Nothing more was needed. They understood each other with the efficiency of people who had both arrived at the same place through the same mechanism, and the specific economy of that understanding was its own kind of statement about how reliably the mechanism operated. Devlin closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, not to escape, but to think, with the kind of undistracted focus that the peculiar quiet of a holding cell at 11:30 at night actually facilitated, in the way that the most extreme constraints sometimes produce the most concentrated clarity. He was thinking about a name from the internal affairs files. Marcus Tillman, 34 years old, South Ward resident, stopped by Colt Reeves in 2021 on fabricated disorderly conduct charges, held for 6 hours, released when a witness came forward with footage, charges dropped. And then, nothing. No consequence for Reeves, no acknowledgement from the city. Marcus Tillman had gone back to his life, which included a job at a warehouse on the east side of Maplewood. Except that the 6 hours he spent in a cell like this one had cost him a shift, and the shift had cost him a formal attendance warning, and the warning had contributed to a performance review that had contributed to a layoff 4 months later, during a company restructuring. Devlin sat in cell 7 and thought about Marcus Tillman, and about all the names he didn't know that the files hadn't captured. The people who had absorbed what Reeves had done to them and had not filed a complaint because filing a complaint was itself a form of exposure, a way of announcing yourself to an institution that had already demonstrated it was not on your side. He thought about the distance between where he was sitting and where he would be sitting in 24 hours behind a desk on the 7th floor of City Hall, and about how that distance was not available to Marcus Tillman, and about what that meant for who bore the cost of systems that were never corrected. This was the thing that sitting in cell 7 clarified for him, the thing he had known intellectually and now knew in his body, his ability to make tonight's choice, to come here voluntarily to gather this evidence, to know with certainty that he had the phone number and the credibility and the institutional weight to walk out of this building on his own terms. That ability was a form of protection that most of the people who had sat in this cell before him had never had. And the fact that he had it, while they didn't, was not a reason to feel grateful. It was a reason to build something different. A memory surfaced unbidden and precise. His mother, Gloria, coming home at dawn after the overnight shift, still in her work shoes, setting her keys on the hook by the door, turning to look at him where he sat at the kitchen table, doing homework at 5 in the morning, because the house was too small to sleep through her return. "Still here?" she would say. "That's something." He had heard it so many times, it had become air, something breathed rather than noticed. But tonight, sitting in cell 7 in his own city, the words landed with a weight they had never carried before. Because tonight, he understood that still here was not a minor thing. Still here was the whole thing. 25 minutes after he was placed in cell 7, Devlin stood from the bench, walked to the bars, wrapped his hands around the cold steel, and called out in a voice that carried through the holding area with the unhurried authority of a man who was not asking for a favor. He wanted his phone call, as provided by law. From his desk in the bullpen, Reeves heard the request, and let a theatrical pause develop before he looked up. The pause of a man performing the fact that he was busy, and this was an interruption. And then he said something dismissive about getting to it when he got to it, phrasing designed to communicate that the timeline was his, and the right was his to administer. It was Kowalski who finally acted, not out of any particular sympathy for the man in cell 7, but out of the specific liability awareness that 30 years of desk service develops the recognition that procedural shortcuts have a way of becoming legal exposure, and that the man in cell 7, for reasons Kowalski couldn't quite articulate, struck him as exactly the kind of person whose procedural shortcuts would become legal exposure. Devlin was escorted to the wall phone at the end of the holding area corridor, a battered metal unit bolted to the cinder block, the kind of phone that communicated everything about the purpose of the room it served. Reeves made a comment walking away about who he was planning to call, something that was meant to be cutting and landed as merely sad, the way the contempt of small men always does when it is aimed at someone who is already thinking past them. The number Devlin dialed was 12 digits. It was not a lawyer. It was not Renee, though he thought of her in the moment before he dialed and felt the specific weight of knowing that she was across town, probably still awake, probably working or reading, unaware of where her husband was. The number he dialed was a secure municipal emergency line, a channel established in the city's emergency management infrastructure for situations that required direct communication between the mayor's office and senior city officials without going through switchboards or staffers. A channel designed for mass casualty events, infrastructure catastrophes, and threats to public order. He had memorized it during his first week in office, the way he memorized everything important, by writing it out by hand 3 times until his hand knew it as well as his mind did. He stood at the wall phone in his socked feet, his wrists still raw from the cuffs, the encrypted phone still in his chest pocket, and made a decision about how much to reveal and when not. Because he was uncertain about what needed to happen, but because the sequence in which it happened mattered enormously to what the record would show, and what the record would build toward. He could call in his identity now, and the whole thing in the next 10 minutes, with a single sentence to the right person, and walk out of this precinct before midnight. But ending it now meant ending it as a personal incident. The mayor was wrongly arrested, the officer is punished, the story is contained. The system closes around the exception and carries on unchanged. That was not what tonight was for. What tonight was for was broader than Devlin Carter's personal dignity, broader than Colt Reeves's badge, broader than one bad stop on one wet street in one patrol sector. He wanted the chief of police to stand in this precinct and see what his officers had built inside it. He wanted the record to include every minute of what had happened tonight, not just the minutes that were convenient. He wanted the people in this building to understand from the inside what the inside looked like, because understanding that was the precondition for changing it. He picked up the receiver. He dialed. Chief of Police Howard Marsh was 57 years old and had been with the Maplewood Police Department for 28 of them, long enough to have seen 4 mayors come and go, long enough to have built something that he could call a career with a straight face, long enough to have made the specific kind of peace with imperfect institutions that requires a person to stop asking certain questions because the answers are too uncomfortable to act on. He was not a bad man. This was important to establish because it was true, and because the story of how systems perpetuate their own harm is never only the story of bad men. It is also, and perhaps more perniciously, the story of decent men who are too tired, too invested, too committed to the apparatus they have spent their lives building to dismantle the parts of it that don't work. Marsh had known for years that certain officers in his department were operating outside the lines of what the department officially endorsed. He had known about Reeves specifically, had read the complaint file, had heard the arbitration decisions, had received the memos from the city's insurance carrier each time a lawsuit was settled, and had each time found a reason to believe that the union mechanism and the disciplinary process and the mandatory training were adequate responses. Because the alternative, a sustained campaign to force accountability against a union that had demonstrated it would fight every termination indefinitely, required a kind of institutional energy and political capital that never seemed to be available at the right moment. He was awake at 12:03 in the morning because he was almost always awake, because 28 years of the job had rewired his relationship with sleep in ways that no vacation and no wellness program had successfully addressed. He was at his desk in the study of his house, working through the city's request for the department's 5-year equipment budget, when the alert on his screen showed the secure municipal emergency code, and he was upright before the second ring completed. The voice on the other end was calm, in a way that communicated to a man of Marsh's experience that the caller had moved beyond the agitated phase of whatever situation they were calling about, and had arrived at the phase where planning was already underway. The cold, controlled calm of someone who is describing a problem they have already decided how to address. "Bob, it's Devlin," the voice said, and Marsh felt every cell in his body go very still, because only 4 people had that number, and one of them was the newly elected mayor. And the mayor was calling from it at midnight, and the mayor's voice had that particular quality of calm that communicated everything except calm. What followed was 4 minutes and 20 seconds of the most consequential phone call Howard Marsh had ever received in 28 years of city service. Devlin described what had happened with the precision of a man filing a complaint, rather than venting an injury the stop without probable cause. The fabricated traffic violations, the order to exit the vehicle, the force used, the handcuffs, and the specific way they were applied, the charges that had been filed, the precinct where he currently was. He named the officer. He named the cruiser. He gave Marsh the sequence of events in chronological order, and without embellishment. Marsh felt the blood leave his face in a way that was not metaphorical. It was a physical sensation, a cold wash that started at his forehead and moved downward, leaving his hands slightly unsteady on the desk surface. The specific nausea that follows the recognition that something you have allowed to persist has now become something impossible to contain moved through him, and he did not excuse himself from it, because there was no excuse available, and because Devlin Carter was still on the phone. "Are you hurt?" Marsh asked, the first question, the human question before the professional one. "Wrists are raw, that's secondary," Devlin said. "Get here." Marsh was already pulling a uniform shirt from his closet before the call disconnected. He buttoned it wrong in the dark and didn't notice until he was in the driveway. Marsh made his second call while pulling out of his driveway, to a number he knew from 20 years of working alongside one of the most capable officers he had encountered in nearly 3 decades of service. Captain Eloise Drummond commanded the 3rd Precinct, and she had arrived at that rank by being over 30 years the best officer in every room she entered, and by never once waiting for someone to acknowledge it, because she had learned early in her career that waiting for acknowledgement was a strategy that paid out poorly for women of her generation in police work, and that the only reliable currency was the kind of performance that made acknowledgement beside the point. She was 51 years old, had 3 departmental commendations and no complaints, and answered her phone on the 2nd ring, because she was as she always was when someone called at unusual hours, already awake. Marsh gave her the information in as few words as possible. Who was in the 4th Precinct, how he had gotten there, what Marsh needed her to do. And she listened without interrupting, which was what she did when she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. There was one question before she said she would be there. Who did they arrest? And the silence that preceded Marsh's answer told her everything about the magnitude of what she was driving toward. And she asked nothing further, because she had 30 years of experience reading the weight of silences, and this one was unambiguous. She was in uniform and in her car before Marsh finished the sentence that confirmed what the silence had already communicated. Devlin returned to cell 7 and sat. The older man in the work jacket was still sleeping. The younger man against the wall was still awake, watching Devlin, with the patient, evaluating attention of someone who had a lot of experience observing what happened in rooms like this one, and who could tell that the man who had just come back from the phone was not the kind of man who usually sat in cell 7 without being entirely sure what kind of man he was instead. Devlin was not thinking about Colt Reeves. He had thought about Reeves enough, had documented him thoroughly enough in the 40 minutes since the cruiser pulled away from Westbrook Avenue that Reeves was now a closed file in his mind, a matter for the morning and the days that followed. What Devlin was thinking about, with the focused intensity that the cell's strange quiet permitted, was a name that he had been carrying since his 3rd week in office. Marcus Tillman, 34 years old, stopped by Colt Reeves in 2021. Held for 6 hours, released when a witness came forward. Charges dropped. No consequence for Reeves, no acknowledgement from the city. Marcus Tillman, who had gone back to his warehouse job and received a formal attendance warning for the hours he'd missed, in a cell just like this one, and who had lost that job 4 months later, and who had filed a formal complaint with the city that had been reviewed and dismissed at the supervisory level in a process that took 11 months and produced a 3-paragraph letter that contained the phrase, "insufficient evidence to support sustained findings." A phrase so designed to say nothing that it had required a skilled attorney to write it. Devlin was thinking about what it meant that the same night, the same officer, the same cell had happened to both of them, and about the enormous, unbridgeable distance between their experiences of it. Not because the cell was different, or the officer was different, or the mechanism was different, but because of what waited outside the cell for each of them. Marcus Tillman had walked out of a cell like this one and gone back to a life that had been made worse by having been here. Devlin Carter would walk out of this cell and go back to the office from which he controlled the department that had put him in it. He stayed with that thought, without flinching from it the way he had learned to stay with uncomfortable truths that required action rather than avoidance. He stayed with the understanding that his presence in this cell tonight was in one crucial sense a performance of solidarity that was not available to the people for whom this cell was not a choice, but a condition. And that the thing that made it different was not his suffering or his nobility, but his power. And that the only ethical use of that power was to make sure that the mechanism that had put Marcus Tillman here for 6 hours without consequence was never able to do that to Marcus Tillman, or anyone like him, again. The trap logic that had seemed so clear in the elevator of City Hall let Reeves commit fully, let the record build itself, let the evidence be undeniable, had expanded in the holding cell into something larger and more urgent. He was not just building a case against one officer. He was building an argument for why the structure that had protected that officer for 14 years needed to be taken apart and rebuilt on principles that actually matched the ones printed on the department's letterhead. The encrypted phone against his chest was the thinnest possible barrier between who he was in this cell and who he would be in the morning. He pressed his hand flat against his chest for a moment, feeling the hard edge of it through the hoodie fabric. A small, tactile reminder that the distance between these two versions of himself was real and available. The young man against the wall watched this gesture and said nothing. His expression had not changed, but something in it had shifted slightly. The evaluating attention had resolved into something closer to recognition, though exactly what he recognized, Devlin could not have said. Still here, Devlin thought. That's something. At 12:31 in the morning, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into the underground parking structure of the 4th Precinct within 90 seconds of each other, their headlights washing briefly over the concrete pillars before cutting off the engines, dying into the specific silence of a space that amplifies everything. Howard Marsh stepped out of his vehicle in a uniform that was buttoned incorrectly. He noticed it now in the garage light and corrected it quickly, because some forms of dignity mattered even when larger ones were collapsing. Eloise Drummond stepped out of hers in a uniform that was, as always, impeccable, because 30 years of needing to be unassailable in rooms that looked for reasons to dismiss her had made impeccability a reflex rather than a choice. They stood for a moment between their vehicles in the concrete quiet of the parking structure, and Drummond looked at Marsh with the clear, assessing eyes of a person who always needed to know the full dimensions of a problem before she could address it effectively. Marsh told her everything in 40 seconds, what Devlin had told him on the phone, the relevant context about Reeves's file, what Devlin had asked for, and why. Drummond listened without expression, the way she listened to everything, absorbing it completely, reserving her response until the information was complete. When Marsh finished, she said only, "I'll take command of the floor once you make the introduction." It was not a request, and it was not a question. It was the statement of a person who had assessed the situation and identified the most efficient distribution of roles. Marsh put his hand on the handle of the door leading to the booking area. He stood there for 1 second, not hesitating exactly, but acknowledging in the way that a man who has spent 28 years in public service sometimes must, the full weight of what is on the other side of a door before he opens it. He was about to walk into the precinct that his department operated, in the city that his department served, to find the mayor of that city in a holding cell because one of his officers had put him there. And the thing he was about to be required to do was not just fix this incident. It was begin the process of accounting for everything that had made this incident possible. He felt the weight of that. He let himself feel it. Then he opened the door. The bullpen of the 4th Precinct at 12:33 in the morning was not a quiet place, but it had its own particular texture of late-night noise. Phones ringing in cycles, keyboards clicking. The low-frequency radio static that was the constant background music of any police precinct. 2 detectives at adjacent desks talking to each other, without looking away from their monitors. A civilian records clerk near the back wall, working through a stack of folders with the mechanical focus of someone on a deadline. Colt Reeves was at a desk near the middle of the room, his arrest report open on the terminal in front of him, his head slightly down, his posture communicating a satisfaction that had not yet been disturbed. He was in the phase that followed a successful stop. The internal narrative was fully formed and internally consistent. The paperwork was proceeding. The person he had put in the cell was where he wanted him, and the evening had confirmed once again what he had always believed about who belonged where, and what their presence in the wrong place signified. Jake Calloway sat at the adjacent terminal, doing something that looked like report work, but was actually the textual equivalent of staring at a wall. His eyes were on the screen, but his attention was somewhere else, in the specific elsewhere of a person who is trying not to think about something that keeps presenting itself for thinking about. He had been trying since the moment the cruiser pulled into the precinct garage to file the evening's events in the folder in his mind labeled, "This is just how it works." And the events kept refusing to stay filed. The heavy door opened. Kowalski was the first to register it, not because he saw it first, but because he felt it, in the way that long-serving desk sergeants feel changes in a room, the shift in air pressure that precedes a significant arrival. He looked up and came out of his chair in a single movement, his spine straightening to a position it hadn't occupied in years. The detectives at the adjacent desks stopped talking first, then stopped typing. Reeves looked up last because he was focused on his report, and because nothing in 14 years of service had trained him to expect that an arrival like this was directed at him. Howard Marsh crossed the linoleum floor with the 4-starred authority of a chief of police who was running on adrenaline and controlled fury, and he did not look at Colt Reeves. That deliberate omission, the chief's eyes moving across the room without landing on the arresting officer, communicated something to Reeves that he could not yet fully interpret, but that registered in his chest as cold. Eloise Drummond followed 2 paces behind Marsh, and when her eyes did cross Reeves, they settled on him for exactly 1 second, with an expression that experienced officers recognize and newer officers learn the hard way, the expression of someone who has already completed their assessment of a situation and found the result to be exactly what they feared. Marsh reached Kowalski's desk. 1 word, 1 request. The booking log. Kowalski had it through the slot in the glass in under 15 seconds. Marsh took it, read the most recent entry, and became very still in the way that people become still when the worst possible confirmation arrives at the exact moment they hoped it would be wrong. He read the name under suspect. He read the officer number under arresting officer. He looked at Drummond. He handed her the log without speaking. She read it. She looked at Reeves. And the look she gave him was the look of a captain who had in 30 years of service developed the specific vocabulary of expression required for moments when the facts were so clear that language was almost redundant. Reeves saw both of them looking at his arrest report with expressions that did not correspond to any scenario his mind had prepared for, and the cold thing in his chest started to become something more specific, though his ego was still working very hard to prevent him from naming it accurately. Marsh turned from the booking desk and walked toward the holding cells, and the quality of his walk, purposeful, unhurried, not looking back, communicated to the room that whatever was happening was serious enough to require the chief's personal attention, which was the kind of information that spread through a precinct bullpen in seconds. Drummond fell into step behind him. Kowalski, after a beat of internal deliberation, followed at a respectful distance. Reeves started to push back from his desk, stood halfway, and caught a look from Drummond that completed the phrase, "Sit down," without requiring any of the syllables. He sat. The hallway to the holding cells was 22 feet long and smelled of the specific compound of institutional disinfectant and human proximity that accumulates in corridors where people are taken when the night has gone wrong for them. Marsh walked it with his eyes forward, but what was happening inside him during those 22 feet was not something that would have appeared on any exterior reading. He was experiencing simultaneously the professional assessment of a situation that required immediate and decisive action, and the personal reckoning of a man who had spent years making choices he now understood as failures, and who was about to be required to account for them in front of the person those choices had most directly harmed. He reached cell 7. He looked through the bars. Devlin Carter was sitting on the concrete bench with his hands resting on his knees, his back straight, his face carrying the composed, alert expression of a man who has been using his waiting time well. The gray hoodie was slightly wrinkled. His feet were in socked feet, both shoes removed as part of the booking process. On his wrists, visible even in the dim light of the cell, were the raw red marks left by cuffs that had been applied with deliberate force. He looked up at Marsh with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have prepared for a moment and are now simply present in it. Marsh removed his cap. The gesture was not formal, it was involuntary, the physical reflex of a man confronting something that demanded deference beyond what rank required. 28 years of command experience had given him a vocabulary for most situations. For this one, he had nothing prepared. Drummond stepped forward and produced the cell key. The lock turned. The door swung open. Devlin did not stand. He told them in the same tone he had used on Westbrook Avenue, calm, measured with the specific gravity of a man who has decided precisely what he's going to do, and does not need to perform urgency, that he was going to remain where he was until he had said what needed to be said in this room, and that he would walk out on his own terms when he was finished. Marsh and Drummond exchanged a glance. Then they waited. Devlin stood. The description of this required more than the single word, because what happened when Devlin Carter rose from the concrete bench of cell 7 was not simply a man standing up. It was a redistribution of weight in the room, a recalibration of what the room contained, the way a vacuum fills when something larger than the space previously held moves into it. He was wearing a worn gray hoodie and dark jeans, and one man's worth of 30 years of work toward becoming someone who could sit in a cell like this one and walk out of it without having surrendered anything essential. And all of that was present in the way he straightened, the way his shoulders set, the way his eyes moved from Marsh to Drummond and back, without urgency or theater. He walked out of cell 7, socked, feet quiet on the concrete, and moved down the hallway toward the bullpen with Marsh on his left and Drummond on his right, and the quality of that procession unannounced, unhurried, 3 people walking at the pace of people who know where they're going, preceded them into the room by several seconds, because the people in the bullpen who had been watching the hallway felt the shift before they could see what caused it. Devlin entered the bullpen, and it became very quiet, in the way that rooms become quiet when something is happening that everyone present understands is significant. A significance they can feel but not yet fully account for. He stopped in the center of the room. He did not perform the moment. He stood in it, taking in the space with the unhurried attention of someone who had been in many rooms that were designed to diminish the people brought into them, and had learned that the most effective response to that design was to not cooperate with its intention. His eyes moved across the room and found Colt Reeves. Reeves was sitting at his desk, and the recognition that Devlin Carter was the man in cell 7 the man in the gray hoodie, the man from the Malibu, the man on Westbrook Avenue, moved through Reeves in the way that seismic events move through structures, not all at once, but in a sequence, each wave compounding the damage of the one before. The first wave was disorientation, a mismatch between the man in the cell and the man who was now standing in the center of the bullpen with the chief of police beside him. The second wave was recognition. The campaign posters, the election coverage, the name on the arrest report, connecting to the face in front of him. The third wave was the full-dimensional understanding of what he had done and to whom, and what that meant. And this wave was the one that produced the physical response, the blood draining from his face in a path that was visible from 6 feet away. His hand releasing the pen it had been holding, the pen striking the linoleum with a sound that was the loudest thing in the room in that moment. His weight settling back in the chair, as if the chair were the only thing still holding him upright. He was breathing, but barely, in the shallow way of someone whose body has prioritized processing the information over the secondary functions of respiration. His eyes were fixed on Devlin Carter, with an expression that had no professional component left in it at all. It was entirely personal, entirely physiological. The face of a man confronting the full consequence of himself. Calloway at the adjacent desk had not moved since Marsh entered the bullpen. He was sitting with his hands flat on the desk surface, his spine straight, his eyes on Devlin, and what was on Calloway's face was not the shock of surprise, but something more complicated. The specific expression of a person who has been dreading a moment and is now living in it, and who understands that how they respond to the next 60 seconds will constitute the most important decision they have made so far in their professional life. Devlin looked at the room the detectives who had stopped typing the records clerk, who had put down her folder Kowalski at the booking desk, sitting perfectly still. The 2 overnight officers near the back wall, standing at something adjacent to attention without having been ordered to. He looked at all of them, and then he turned to Colt Reeves, and he began. He did not raise his voice. This was the first thing that registered, and it was the thing that made what he said land with the force that it did. The absence of anger in his delivery, the complete refusal to perform outrage when what he had instead was something colder and more durable. He spoke at the volume of a man talking in a room that had decided to be silent for him, which was not quite the same as a quiet room, because this silence had been chosen by the people in it, earned by the quality of what they were hearing. He began with the record. His name, his title, what had happened on Westbrook Avenue in chronological order, with the specificity of a man filing a complaint that he intended to hold up in every subsequent proceeding. The stop without probable cause, the fabricated traffic violations, the commands to exit the vehicle, the force used during the pat-down, the handcuffs applied with deliberate excess, the charges listed on the arrest report, failure to comply, resisting, suspicion of prowling. Charges that were fabrications and which he named as fabrications without editorial comment, the way a lawyer names the elements of a charge, because calling something a lie when the evidence makes it a lie is not editorial. It is accuracy. He let the record stand for a moment in the silence of the room, and then he moved to the larger point. He told the room that he had grown up 6 blocks from the overpass that divided Northgate from the South Ward on the south side of it, in a house on Calloway Street, where his mother came home every morning from the overnight laundry shift and set her keys on a hook and said the same thing before she went to sleep. He did not sentimentalize this. He did not use it to ask for sympathy. He stated it as context, because context was what the room needed to understand what tonight meant, beyond the specifics of his own injury. He told them that his cousin had been stopped 4 times on Northgate Avenue in a single year, without a charge ever being filed, without an explanation ever being offered, without any mechanism available to him for contesting the stops or their cost, the hours lost, the anxiety accumulated, the simple grinding weight of being treated as suspicious in a city that was also his city. He told them that he had run for mayor not because he wanted the office, but because he had spent a decade watching what power did to people who had none of it, and had concluded that the only way to change the outcome was to change who made the decisions. Then he turned to Colt Reeves. He read from memory, and the room understood from the precision with which he recited the numbers that this was not incidental knowledge, but prepared knowledge. The knowledge of a man who had done his homework before he came anywhere near this precinct. The number of complaints in Reeves's file, the number of lawsuits settled with public funds, the disciplinary hearing that had been reduced to a written warning, the complaint filed by Marcus Tillman in 2021, the 6 hours Marcus Tillman had spent in a cell like the one Devlin had just left, the job Marcus Tillman had lost because of those hours, the complaint that had been reviewed and dismissed in 11 months, in a letter that said, insufficient evidence to support sustained findings. He said all of this without heat, the way a doctor names a diagnosis, not to wound, but because the naming is the precondition for the treatment. Then he addressed Calloway directly, and the room felt the shift in weight as his attention moved to the young officer at the adjacent desk. He told Calloway that he had heard on Westbrook Avenue the sound of a person trying to intervene and stopping short of it, and that he understood the pressure that produced that particular stop short, understood it from years of working with people inside institutions that punished principled dissent and rewarded silence, and that he did not hold the inadequacy of Calloway's intervention against him the way he held the actions of a 14-year veteran against that veteran. But he told Calloway something else, that the young officer was the only person in this room who had not yet decided who he was going to be, and that the decision he made starting tonight would define every day of his service that followed, and that inadequate intervention was still intervention, which meant the capacity for it was present, and that capacity was something to build on, rather than something to be ashamed of, as long as it was built on. He addressed the room, every officer present, not as a collective abstraction, but as individuals who were each making decisions every night about what the badge they wore required of them, and what it permitted. And he told them that what had happened to him on Westbrook Avenue happened on streets in this city every week, to people who did not have an emergency municipal number memorized, who did not have the legal vocabulary to identify violations as they occurred, who did not have the institutional weight to make what happened to them matter to anyone with the authority to change it. He told them that those people were the citizens of Maplewood, the people this department was paid to serve, the people whose taxes funded the uniforms and the vehicles and the building they were standing in, and that the distance between how those citizens were treated and how the department's stated values said they should be treated was the distance he intended to spend his term in office. Closing. He looked at Reeves one last time, and in his voice was the specific quality that belongs to statements that are not made in anger and therefore cannot be answered with defensiveness, that are simply precisely and irrevocably true. You saw a black man in a hoodie on a street in Northgate and decided he didn't belong, he said. You were right about one thing. I don't belong in a cage in my own city. Neither does anyone else. The room held that sentence for a moment, the way rooms hold things that have just changed their shape. Devlin turned to Howard Marsh, and his directives were specific, calm, and numbered in the way of a man who had been composing them for the last 40 minutes while sitting in cell 7. He wanted Reeves relieved of his weapon and badge immediately, placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a full civil rights review with the arrest report preserved exactly as filed as a document of perjury, not amended, not supplemented, not buried in the revision process that IA sometimes used to soften the evidence of misconduct before it could be used. Preserved as written, in Reeves's own words, as the foundation of what would follow. He wanted the body camera footage from both officers secured to the chain of evidence before the shift ended. He wanted Marcus Tillman's complaint file pulled from the archive and reviewed. Marsh turned to Drummond. She was already moving. She crossed the room to where Reeves sat, and her approach had the quality of inevitability, not aggressive, not performative, simply the forward motion of someone who has been given a job that needs doing and intends to do it completely. She stopped in front of his desk and looked at him with the professional flatness of a captain addressing a subordinate who is about to cease being one. She told him to stand and remove his duty belt. What followed happened in slow motion in the perception of everyone present, in the way that significant events slow themselves in the observation of the people watching them, because the significance is processed faster than the eyes can take it in, and so the eyes linger longer than usual on each component of what is occurring, as if to make sure of it. Reeves pushed back his chair. The scrape of the legs on the linoleum was very loud in the silence of the room. He stood not at his full height, not with the weight he had carried on Westbrook Avenue, but with a diminishment that was visible in the set of his shoulders and the downward angle of his head. A man who had been inflated by the authority he was about to lose, and was already beginning to understand the dimensions of himself without it. His hands went to his belt buckle with the unfamiliarity of a man performing a motion in the wrong direction. He removed the radio. He handed it to Drummond. He unclipped the holster, the weight of the service weapon familiar in his grip in a way that was about to become only a memory, and handed it over. He reached to his chest and unclipped the silver shield, the badge that had been his armor and his license and his permission for 14 years, and placed it in Drummond's open palm. The pin made a small sound when it left the fabric of his uniform. Very small. But in the silence of the bullpen, everyone heard it. Calloway watched this from his desk. What was on his face was not satisfaction. He was not built for satisfaction at another person's destruction, even when the destruction was earned, but something more complex and harder to name. The expression of a person who is watching the consequence of a system they have been part of, and who is beginning to understand what it costs to have been part of it, without resistance. Reeves tried to speak. He tried to construct the sentence that would begin to explain, to contextualize, to reframe what the room had just witnessed. The beginning of the argument that he hadn't known that the circumstances were ambiguous, that 14 years of service should count for something, and Devlin looked at him with a silence so complete and so fully inhabited that the words simply did not survive their passage through it. They did not become sentences. They became nothing. Drummond told Reeves to take a seat against the wall and wait for Internal Affairs and HR, who would be there before the shift ended. He was no longer under arrest. He was now the subject of an investigation, which was a different kind of constraint, but not a lighter one. He walked to the chair against the wall, and every step he took toward it was a step further from the man he had been 2 hours ago. And the distance was already permanent. Devlin did not watch him walk. He had seen what he needed to see. He turned to Calloway, and the room waited after the room had reorganized itself around what had just happened. Reeves against the wall, Drummond coordinating with the IA duty officer by phone, Marsh on his own call in the captain's office, the other officers in the bullpen resuming the night's work with the particular subdued focus of people who have witnessed something they will be processing for weeks. Devlin pulled a chair from the nearest desk, turned it around, and sat down across from Jake Calloway, not standing over him, not commanding him, sitting at his level, in the posture of two people about to have a conversation, rather than a person of authority addressing a subordinate. Because the conversation Devlin intended to have with this young officer was not about authority. Calloway had not moved from his desk since Devlin entered the bullpen. His hands were still flat on the desk surface. His eyes were slightly red at the edges, not crying, but the proximate state, the state of someone who has been holding something tightly enough that the pressure is finding outlets. He was waiting with the terrible patience of someone who expects what is coming to be bad, and has decided the most dignified response is to receive it without flinching. Devlin looked at him for a moment, before speaking the way a person looks at someone when they want to actually see them, rather than just address them. He told Calloway that he had heard him on Westbrook Avenue. He had heard the objection that started and stopped the attempt that didn't complete itself, and he wanted Calloway to know that he had noticed it, not to punish him for the inadequacy of it, but because the fact that it existed at all was significant. and he did not want Calloway to think it had been invisible. He told him in direct and specific terms what the cost of inadequate intervention had been, not to Devlin, who had resources and options that made tonight ultimately manageable, but to people like Marcus Tillman, who had sat in a cell in this same building because of this same officer, and had walked out of it into a life that was made concretely worse by having been there, and for whom the moment when someone might have said, "No, stop, this isn't right," had passed without anyone saying it. He told Calloway that he was not taking his badge tonight, and he meant it, and he wanted Calloway to understand why not. Because what Calloway had done was sufficient, but because what Calloway had done was salvageable. And because a young officer with a functioning conscience and the evidence of one attempted intervention was a different proposition than a 14-year veteran with 11 complaints, and a pattern that had been enabled for so long it had become institutional practice. The distinction mattered. The potential in the distinction mattered. But he told Calloway something else, something that was not comfort, but was instead the weight of what being given a second chance actually required. He said that the only way Calloway's badge meant anything going forward was if every time from tonight forward that he found himself in a situation where someone next to him was doing what Reeves had done on Westbrook Avenue, he chose differently. Not eventually, not when it felt safe. Every time. Because the uniform either meant something or it didn't, and the only person who could decide which was the person wearing it. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What should I do now?" And the question was not rhetorical. It was the genuine, uncomplicated question of a young man who had lost his bearings and was asking for a compass heading rather than a speech. Devlin's answer was simple and specific. Write down everything that happened tonight, every detail, in his own words, tonight before he slept, and submit it to Drummond in the morning without omission, and without the kind of softening language that instinct would tell him to use to protect his professional position. All of it. Then go home. Then decide on his own, and without anyone else's input, whether the kind of officer he wanted to be for the next 30 years was the kind of officer who would make a different choice on the next Westbrook Avenue, or the kind who would make the same one. Because both answers to that question were available to him, and both answers would define everything that followed. Calloway nodded, and then he did something that surprised them both. He lowered his head for a moment, and when he raised it, there were tears on his face. The quiet tears of someone who has been carrying the weight of a choice they made badly, and has just been told unexpectedly that the carrying is recognized, even if the choice is not excused. He said, "I understand. I swear it." Devlin put one hand briefly on Calloway's shoulder, the hand of a person offering acknowledgement rather than absolution, and stood. The captain's office on the second floor of the 4th precinct was a small room that smelled of the accumulated paper of years of administrative work reports and memos and budget requests and disciplinary decisions, the documentary residue of a department's life. And at 1:45 in the morning, it contained two men who were having a conversation that both of them had needed to have for longer than either would have easily admitted. Marsh sat behind the desk. Devlin sat across from it. Between them was a cup of coffee that Marsh had poured and Devlin had not yet touched. Marsh began with an apology. It was formal and thorough in the way of apologies from people who understand the magnitude of what they are apologizing for. It did not minimize it, did not qualify. It did not move too quickly toward the logistics of remedy as a way of avoiding the weight of the harm. It was the apology of a man who genuinely knew what he should have done and hadn't done it, and who was not asking for forgiveness because forgiveness was not what this moment required. Devlin received it. He did not dismiss it, and he did not accept it as sufficient because it was not sufficient, and because pretending it was would have been a dishonesty that neither of them could afford in a conversation this consequential. Then he told Marsh something he had not said publicly, that tonight had not been fully accidental, that he had been reviewing the patrol assignment logs for the Northgate sector for several weeks, that Reeves's file was one of 7 he was tracking, that the specific timing of his decision to drive out to Westbrook Avenue on a Tuesday night was connected to his knowledge that Car 31 was assigned to that sector on Tuesday overnight shifts. He did not say this to claim credit for strategic cleverness. He said it because Marsh deserved to know the full picture, and because the full picture was more useful to both of them than a version that made tonight seem like pure chance. Marsh absorbed this with the specific stillness of a man recalibrating. Then he said something that Devlin had not expected from him, something honest in the way that honesty sometimes arrives in extremity, when the defenses that usually prevent it have been overwhelmed by the magnitude of what is happening. He said that he had known about Reeves for years. Not just the file, the reality behind the file, the pattern, the protection, the cost of it to the people who had absorbed what Reeves did and had no mechanism for recourse. He said that he had told himself each time the question of meaningful accountability had arisen that the union mechanism was too powerful and the arbitration process too rigged and the political will too fragile to make terminations stick, and that the path of managed liability was the only realistic option available to him. He said that he had believed this for long enough and cited it to himself often enough that it had stopped feeling like an excuse and it started feeling like a fact. And he said that sitting in this office at 1:45 in the morning, across from the mayor of Maplewood, who had just spent 40 minutes in a holding cell in his own precinct, he understood that it had never been a fact. It had always been an excuse, and he was ashamed of having let it function as one for as long as he had. He said he did not expect forgiveness for it. He was simply saying it out loud to someone who deserved to hear it. Devlin listened to all of it, without interrupting, which was the most useful thing he could do with it. Then he told Marsh exactly what was coming: a full civil rights audit of the Northgate patrol sector, conducted by an independent external firm, with access to all records, including the complaint files, the arbitration decisions, the settlement documentation, and the IA review notes. Mandatory body cameras on every patrol officer in Maplewood within 90 days, funded by redirecting the patrol division's equipment budget away from items that had been requested and not yet approved. A new civilian oversight board with genuine subpoena power and a publicly accessible complaint portal. An end to the department's practice of settling complaints under confidentiality agreements. Any settlement of a civil rights complaint against a Maplewood officer would be a matter of public record, including the amount, the nature of the complaint, and the officer's name. Marsh asked after a moment whether he still had a job. Devlin's answer was precise in the way of a man who had been thinking about this question since the cruiser pulled away from Westbrook Avenue, for now conditionally. And the condition was complete and unimpeded cooperation with every element of the audit and reform process, which meant no union interference, initiated or facilitated at the department leadership level, no document delays, no selective recollection in subsequent interviews or proceedings. If that condition held, Marsh kept his job and became an active participant in building the thing that should have been built years ago. If the condition failed, Marsh became part of the record that explained why the reform was necessary, which was a different and less comfortable position. They shook hands. It was not a warm handshake. It was a firm one, the handshake of two men who understood each other well enough to know that what mattered now was not the relationship, but the work. Devlin walked out of the precinct at 2:15 in the morning and stood on the wet pavement of the street outside, and the rain had stopped, and the air was the particular clean that October air in Maplewood becomes after a rain, cool and without pretense, carrying the smell of wet concrete and the distant faint sweetness of the Bradford pear trees from the median strips of Northgate 2 blocks north. He took out his phone, his personal phone, not the encrypted one, and called Renee. She answered on the first ring, which was how he knew she had been awake. And the fact that she answered on the first ring without saying anything immediately, just the sound of her breathing, present and ready, was one of the specific expressions of love that he had come to recognize and depend on over 16 years. The love that does not announce itself but simply materializes at the moment it is needed, fully formed, and without condition. He told her everything in under 3 minutes, because he had learned long ago that Renee's capacity to understand a complicated situation was faster than most people's, and required no scaffolding, and that giving her more detail than she needed was a way of protecting himself from her questions, rather than actually communicating with her. He told her where he had been and how he had gotten there, what had happened on Westbrook Avenue and in the booking area, and in Cell 7, and in the bullpen. What he had said to Reeves and to Calloway and to Marsh, and what the next weeks were going to require of him. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened to him when she was paying the fullest attention, which he had learned to distinguish from her listening when she was processing something simultaneously. Because the two felt different, the way two kinds of silence feel different, even when they are made of the same absence of sound. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him the question that cut through everything else with the precision of something that had been sharpened by 16 years of knowing exactly where the essential question lived in any given situation. "Are you okay?" she said. "Not the mayor. You." He stood on the wet sidewalk outside the 4th precinct and thought about that question with the honesty it deserved, because she had asked it honestly, and because she would know immediately if he answered it any other way. He told her that he was. And then he told her something he had not put into words before, not even in the holding cell where he had been thinking it most clearly, that sitting in Cell 7 for 40 minutes, he had understood something about the city he was supposed to be running that no briefing document, at no constituency meeting, and no 7th-floor view from City Hall could have given him the understanding that arrives only from the inside, from the actual weight of the thing pressing against your body, rather than the description of the thing pressing against other people's bodies. He told her that this understanding was the most valuable thing he would carry out of tonight, that it would sit behind every decision he made for the remainder of his term, and that the cost of acquiring it was wrong in the way that many important things are acquired, at a cost that is wrong, and that he was going to spend the rest of his term trying to make sure that the acquisition of that understanding did not require a holding cell to be its classroom. She told him to come home. She would be up. She was making tea. He walked to the Malibu, which Drummond had arranged to be released from the precinct lot, and brought around to the front a quiet, logistical grace that Devlin noted and would remember. He got in, started the engine, and sat for a moment in the specific quiet of his own car, which smelled familiar and ordinary, and like his life before Westbrook Avenue, and which was the same car it had been 6 hours ago, while also being somehow different now, the way a place looks different after something has happened in it. The first week moved fast, and with the efficiency of a process that had been set in motion by something that left no administrative room for delay. Reeves's termination was processed through an emergency HR hearing convened within 72 hours of the incident, at which Captain Drummond presented the body camera footage from Calloway's unit, submitted in full and without redaction, as Calloway had promised, along with the arrest report, which Reeves had filed with his name on it, before the evening ended, and which constituted, in the HR examiner's words, a document that was inconsistent with the video evidence in ways that removed any ambiguity about the nature of the conduct. The police union filed a grievance within 24 hours, as everyone expected, and the city attorney reviewed the footage that same afternoon and advised the union representative that the department's position was not one that arbitration would improve. The grievance was withdrawn before the end of the week. Reeves's pension was suspended pending the outcome of the federal civil rights review. And because the city's new policy announced by Devlin at a press conference on Thursday morning, 2 days after the incident, prohibited the use of confidentiality agreements in officer misconduct settlements, the case became public record immediately, which meant that the 3 prior settlements paid on Reeves's behalf, including the settlement with Marcus Tillman's family, became part of a public file that any journalist or attorney could access. 2 months later, the federal civil rights complaint filed by a South Ward civil rights organization, which had been tracking Reeves's conduct since the Tillman incident and had been waiting with the patience of people who have learned that institutions do not move without pressure, for the kind of pressure that makes movement unavoidable, added 4 names to its complaint, alongside Tillman's. 4 residents of the South Ward and the East End of Northgate who had been stopped, detained, cited, or physically handled by Reeves in ways that the footage and documentation now available made contestable in ways they had never been before. The civil liability was personal to Reeves. The city's new policy, signed by Devlin in his 3rd week in office, prohibited the use of public funds to indemnify officers found to have acted outside their authority in ways that a reasonable officer would have known to be unlawful. And the footage of Westbrook Avenue made Reeves's knowledge of his own unlawfulness a matter of documented record. The legal fees consumed the equity in his house by spring. Sandra did not call. Owen sent one text 3 days after the story ran nationally. I heard. I'm not surprised. There was no question in it, no request. It was simply a statement of the thing he had told his father 16 months ago and had seen confirmed. 6 months after the night of October 14th, a federal judge in a courtroom in the city's district court building sentenced Colt Reeves on 2 counts of civil rights deprivation under color of law to 18 months in a federal correctional facility and permanent decertification as a law enforcement officer in any jurisdiction in the United States. The judge, a woman named Harrington, who had been on the federal bench for 12 years and who had a particular talent for the kind of judicial statement that said what needed to be said without excess, looked at Reeves before delivering the sentence and said the thing that no supervisor and no union representative and no arbitration panel had ever said to him directly in 14 years. The badge you carried was a public trust. You treated it as a weapon. Those are not the same thing, and the law does not pretend they are. There was no one in the gallery for Reeves on sentencing day. 3 months after the night of October 14th, Maplewood was different in ways that were not dramatic and not photogenic, and not the kind of thing that showed up easily in a news segment or a campaign talking point, but which were real in the specific way that change is real when it is built on something rather than announced from above. The body cameras went on, not quietly, not incrementally, all of them, all at once, on a Monday morning in January, when the patrol shift came in and found the new equipment at every station, with a 2-page instruction sheet and a departmental memo from Chief Marsh informing them that the cameras were active and their footage was the property of the public and would be retained for a minimum of 90 days and reviewed by the Civilian Oversight Board upon request. There had been pushback during the rollout period, quiet, procedural, the kind of resistance that institutions mount when they cannot mount louder resistance. And Devlin had met each instance of it with the same response. The cameras were non-negotiable. They were funded, they were operational, and any officer who interfered with their function or deactivated them outside of the designated exceptions would be subject to the same review process that had just concluded with Colt Reeves's decertification. The press conference announcing the rollout was held at Devlin's specific instruction, in the South Ward, not at City Hall, not in Northgate, in the parking lot of the South Ward Community Center on a gray January morning, with the residents of the neighborhood who had the most direct experience of what policing without accountability felt like, standing around the perimeter of the space in the particular posture of people who had been promised things before and were watching carefully to see whether this was different. Devlin spoke for 7 minutes. He made no promises he couldn't keep. He described exactly what the cameras were, what the footage retention policy was, and how residents could request footage review through the Civilian Oversight Board's new public portal. Then he stepped back and introduced the first 3 members of the Oversight Board, who were not city officials and not police officers, but residents. A high school teacher from the South Ward, a small business owner from the East End of the city, and a retired social worker named Corrine Watts, who had lived on Birchwood Street for 34 years, and who had attended every single public meeting about police accountability in Maplewood for the last 8 of them, without ever once seeing anything change in a way she could point to. The first Civilian Oversight Board public meeting was held 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in the South Ward Community Center, and 47 residents attended. Devlin sat in the audience, not at the table, because the meeting was not about him, and he had learned in 6 weeks of making this kind of decision that the most important thing a person in his position could communicate to a room of residents was that their voice was not supplementary to the process. It was the process. Calloway had submitted his full and unredacted account of the events of October 14th to Captain Drummond on the morning of October 15th, as he had told Devlin he would. The account was the most complete and honest documentation of the incident from the officer's perspective, describing every decision Reeves had made and every moment when Calloway had seen the line being crossed and had not crossed back across it in the other direction. And the submission of that account had been both the bravest and the most professionally consequential thing Jake Calloway had done in 7 months on the job. He was placed on probationary status with mandatory ethics training, as the department's policy required for officers connected to misconduct proceedings, and he requested a transfer to the South Ward Community Policing Unit within a week of the probationary period beginning, a voluntary request that surprised his supervising officers, who had assumed he would wait out the probation in the lowest profile assignment available. He was the youngest officer ever to voluntarily request the South Ward beat. He learned the names of the residents on his patrol route with the patient, deliberate attention of someone who understood that this was not peripheral to his job, but central to it. Marcus Tillman came to the Oversight Board's first public meeting. He did not testify. He was not there to speak. He sat in the 3rd row from the back, wearing a dark jacket, and he listened to everything with the contained attention of someone who has learned to evaluate what institutions offer before deciding whether to engage with them. At the end of the meeting, he shook hands with Corinne Watts, who had introduced herself to him before the proceedings began, and he said something to her that she later describes to a journalist as, "I'll come back." He left without speaking to any city official or any press, but he came back. Ray Kowalski retired early, citing health, in November. There was no ceremony and no departmental announcement. He had requested that there be none. He left a single note in the precinct's internal inbox addressed to no one in particular, which Drummond found when she was processing the inbox in her new capacity as acting commander of the 4th Precinct. The note said, "I should have looked more carefully at the things I processed." Drummond read it twice, put it in her desk drawer, and kept it there. On a Sunday morning, 9 days after the night of October 14th, Devlin drove alone to the South Ward without telling anyone where he was going, because some things needed to happen without staff and without calendar and without the infrastructure of the office, and this was one of them. His mother's house on Calloway Street looked the same as it always looked. The same narrow front porch with the same potted geraniums his mother moved inside each fall and outside each spring, with the regularity of a person who has organized her life around reliable rituals. The same pale blue paint on the door that was slightly different from the pale blue it had been the summer before, because Gloria Carter repainted the door every 3 years and had done so since 1988, and saw no reason to change a practice that had served her well. He knocked even though it was his mother's house and the door was unlocked, because knocking was what he had always done, because his mother had raised him with the understanding that entry to another person's space was something you requested rather than assumed, regardless of your relationship to the person or your history with the house. Gloria answered in the way she always answered. She was already moving toward the door before the second knock, because she always knew who it was before she opened it. A sensory attunement to the people she loved that Devlin had stopped trying to explain, and had simply come to accept as one of the properties of his mother. She looked at him the way she looked at him when she needed to assess the state of him before she said anything else. The quick, accurate maternal read that had been the most reliable gauge of his actual condition since he was 6 years old. She stepped back to let him in without speaking. The kitchen was warm coffee, already made. She always had coffee made, regardless of the hour, because coffee was the medium of every important conversation that had ever happened in this house, and she always had it ready. He sat in the chair at the table where he had sat since childhood, the chair that faced the window, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him, and for a moment she said nothing. which was her way of giving him the room to organize himself before she began. Then she told him, with the specificity of a woman who had been thinking about what she wanted to say for 9 days, that she was proud of him, and that she was furious with him, and that both of these things were completely true and completely simultaneous, and not in any way in contradiction with each other. He told her he understood that the fury was as real to him as the pride, and that he had known sitting in that cruiser on the way to the 4th precinct that there was a version of tonight that did not end the way it ended, and that the version he had chosen had required a kind of risk that was his to choose, but not his alone to bear. She told him something then that she had not said to him directly in all the years he had been working toward the office he now held, not at the law firm, not during the campaign, not on the night he won the election, though she had been at all of those moments. She told him that the reason she had driven to every single one of his campaign events, even the ones in neighborhoods where people had looked at her the way they looked at people who had arrived in the wrong room, was not because she was his mother, though she was, and always would be. It was because she believed, with the full weight of what 68 years of living in this city had given her to believe with, that Maplewood could become, under him, with him, through him, a place where a man could sit on a public bench in any neighborhood in the city without being afraid of what was going to come through the door next. That was still what she believed, and she needed him to be alive to build it. He told her he would be. She looked at him the way a mother looks at a son when she has said everything she needed to say and is choosing to believe what he has told her because the alternative is not something she has room for. Then she refilled his coffee and asked if he had eaten breakfast, and when he said he hadn't, she stood up and began making eggs without asking how he wanted them, because she already knew how he wanted them and had always known, and the knowing of it was its own kind of love. On the wall by the door, the hook held her keys. The same hook she had installed in 1987, the same keys she had set on it every morning for 19 years when she came home from the overnight shift. The morning light from the kitchen window caught the metal of the keys and lit them briefly, and Devlin looked at them and thought, still here. That's something. April came to Maplewood the way April comes to cities that have earned it. Gradually, then suddenly, the cold releasing its grip over the course of 2 weeks, in a process so incremental that you don't notice you've stopped bracing against it until one afternoon you're standing outside without your jacket, and you realize the season has already changed around you. On a Tuesday evening, in the 3rd week of April, Devlin Carter drove the Malibu north through the city, after a city council meeting that had run 2 hours longer than scheduled because the infrastructure subcommittee had 14 items on its agenda, and the council member from the Northgate 2nd District had objections to 6 of them that she felt were best expressed at considerable length. He was in his suit, without the cap, without the hoodie, driving in the specific mental state of a man who has processed enough of the day's bureaucratic friction to have room again for the larger picture. He turned onto Westbrook Avenue without particularly deciding to. It was not on his route home. He turned onto it because it was where the story had started, and because he had not been back, and something in the evening, the specific quality of April light in Maplewood, golden and low and unhurried, made it feel like the right time. He pulled to the curb at the exact spot where the Malibu had been parked on October 14th, cut the engine, and sat. The storm drain was gone. In its place, flush with the pavement at the base of the oak tree, was a new graded culvert, precisely installed with the seamless curb repair that characterized work done by contractors who knew they would be photographed for the city's infrastructure reporting portal. The sidewalk was dry. The street was clean. The elementary school half a block away was dark and locked for the evening, waiting for tomorrow's children. He was sitting there in the quiet of a Tuesday evening on a street that had no memory of what it had witnessed 6 months ago. On a county sheriff's cruiser, the Maplewood Police Department's jurisdiction on this block had been reorganized as part of the consent decree following the investigation, with county backup rotating through Northgate on weekday nights, rolled slowly past and stopped alongside him. The officer inside, a young man Devlin did not recognize, lowered his window, and looked at the parked car and its driver with the professional alertness of someone doing their job. And there was a moment, a 2-second moment, when Devlin felt the same thing he had felt on October 14th. The recognition, the awareness, the calibration. And then the officer said, "Everything all right, sir? Need anything?" The simplicity of it. The ordinary professional courtesy of a person doing their job the way the job was supposed to be done. "Everything all right? Need anything?" 15 words with no edge in them, no presumption, no manufactured narrative filling the space between what was visible and what was actually happening. Devlin told him he was fine, just checking something on the road. The officer nodded, said, "Have a good evening, sir," and pulled away. Devlin watched the cruiser in his mirror until it turned the corner at the end of Westbrook Avenue, and then he sat for a moment longer in the specific peace of someone who has seen a thing be different and knows what it cost to make it different, and carries both the cost and the difference simultaneously, without needing to resolve the tension between them. He thought about Cell 7. Not with bitterness. The bitterness had moved through him in the days following October 14th, and had been replaced by something that was not quite peace, but was its direction. He thought about it the way a person thinks about a moment that was terrible and true, and that gave them something they could not have gotten any other way, with the complicated gratitude that is available to people who survived something they did not choose to survive. He started the engine. He drove south, toward home, toward Renee, who would have left a light on, toward Layla, who would ask him over dinner what the hardest part of his day was, and would actually wait for his answer, who had recently started asking follow-up questions that made him think carefully before he spoke, which was one of the specific and unrepeatable gifts of raising a 13-year-old who was paying close attention. He drove over the overpass, the concrete structure that divided Northgate from the South Ward, 14 years old and never once painted. And at the apex of it, in the brief moment before the descent toward the south, he could see both sides of the city simultaneously. Through the windshield and the rear-view mirror, the towers of Northgate behind him, and the narrower streets of the South Ward ahead, the better light and the lesser light. The city as it was, and the city as it was still being built. The gap between them, real and visible, and not yet closed. But, and this was the thing he held on to, the thing he drove toward in the April evening actively narrowing. A year after the night of October 14th, the Maplewood Civilian Oversight Board published its first annual report. And it was not the kind of document that gets read by many people, because annual oversight reports rarely are. But the ones who read it found in it something that was unusual in the genre. It was specific, it was honest, and it did not bury its findings in the language of institutional self-protection. 89 complaints reviewed, 11 officers placed on formal review, 3 terminations recommended to the chief of police, 2 of which were subsequently carried out. On the inside front cover of the report, printed in small, plain type beneath the city seal, was a line submitted by a board member who had been stopped 11 times in 3 years on the streets of Maplewood, without a charge ever being filed against him. Accountability is not punishment. It is the minimum standard of trust. Captain Drummond, who had taken permanent command of the reorganized 4th Precinct in January, had the report printed and pinned to the bulletin board in the hallway outside her roll call room, in the spot where the overtime sign-up sheet used to be. And every officer who came through for their shift walked past it twice a day, and some of them read it, and some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't were watched carefully for the reasons they didn't. Officer Jake Calloway completed his first full year in the South Ward Community Policing Unit in the spring, and he was not yet a good officer in the way that good officers take 10 years to become. He was still learning things the hard way, still making the kinds of mistakes that young officers make when they are trying to build something different from what they were trained beside. But he was an honest one, which is where it starts, and which is not nothing. He knew the residents on his patrol route by name, block by block, and he had not looked away once from the situations that required him not to. And looking back at the year that was, the thing he was most certain about Marcus Tillman, who lived 2 blocks from the eastern edge of Calloway's patrol area, nodded at him when their paths crossed on the street, and Calloway nodded back. And the nod was not friendship, and was not forgiveness, and was not an erasure of anything that had happened. It was acknowledgement. One person recognizing the existence of another in a city that had for a long time made that recognition conditional. And acknowledgement is the first thing that has to exist before anything else can be built on top of it. On the evening of the first anniversary, Devlin Carter was not at City Hall, and not at a press conference, and not at a civic dinner where he would be expected to make remarks about the year's accomplishments. He was at his mother's kitchen table on Calloway Street, drinking coffee that was, as always, stronger than his body strictly required, listening through the wall to his daughter Layla playing piano in the front room, the piece she had been working on for the last month, something with a complicated left hand that she had not quite fully conquered. So what came through the wall was not the finished piece, but the working version, interrupted and restarted the music of someone in the middle of learning, rather than at the end of it. He sat there in the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday evening in his own life, in the house where he had grown up, in the chair that faced the window, and felt, without being entirely able to name it, because some things resist the precision of naming the specific texture of a year that had been harder and realer and more costly and more clarifying than any year he had previously lived through. A year that had taken things from him and given him things that the taking had made possible to receive. On the hook by the door, his mother's keys caught the light from the kitchen window and held it for a moment, bright and simple and unchanged. Still here, he thought. That's something. If this story moved you, if you heard in it something that felt true about justice, about power, about what it costs to demand that the world be better than it has allowed itself to become, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Stories about the moment when accountability finally arrives, when dignity holds its ground, and when one person's refusal to accept the unacceptable becomes the first stone of something worth building.